Thank you for being here. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and that this land was never ceded and was stolen from them, and pay my respects to elders past, present and the future. And maybe you would like to put the lands on Aboriginal lands in the chat that you're on, if you're from Australia, or the traditional owners of lands in which you are from other parts of the world as well. Also like to basically put a trigger warning on this entire panel. We will be discussing biphobia, bi-erasure, mental health, suicidality, and basically getting our ranty pants on about things, but some of those topics are potentially very upsetting, and just want to make sure you're braced for all of that.
I just add a few things. I'm also on Wurundjeri land. If you don't want to type in, you can just reflect, which is just as good. Particularly, I'm on the lands of the Bolan peoples, which translates to lyrebird in English, which I found quite beautiful to find that out a few months ago, or to investigate it. Agree with the content warnings, queerphobia, transphobia, biphobia and other things, but if I can, as much as that is serious, put in, I think it's, to quote Paul Keating, the conversation we have to have.
I'm Bridget, she, her are my pronouns, and I'm on Turrbal and Yagara land in Minjin, which is Brisbane. Yeah, and just mirror everything they both just said about the importance of just looking after yourself, but also knowing when we should have these conversations. So thank you both.
All right, so we had a dress rehearsal for this a couple of weeks ago, and we sort of knocked together some topics. So I think the first one we came up with was the stories of when we realised that the Vote Yes campaign wasn't for us. And for me, that was the television interview immediately after the High Court handed down their decision to allow the postal survey to go ahead. And Anna Brown, who was asked by the media how she felt, said, "Gay and lesbian Australians will be very disappointed today." And I thought, right, this is not a campaign that's going to include my community. How about you, Sal?
Very similar. Mine went back to the night after the Liberal Party room meeting, which from memory was the second Monday night in August. Being numerical retentive as a trained accountant, 6:20 on that Monday, and the microphones were thrust under first Anna Brown, who said the same thing. The gay and lesbian community will be very disappointed. Also, Alex Greenwich said the same thing. I think the positive contrast, which is in one sense a given, is the awesome Janet Rice, out bisexual senator, who just said the LGBTIQA+ communities and didn't even blink, which shows her awesomeness, and we'll come back to other good stuff from Janet Rice towards the end. And then also the message put out by Dr. Karen Phelps, where, and I will say content warning for mention of the Christian lobby ad, where the woman going, "My son was told he had to wear a dress." I should say, when we did a dress rehearsal, we could have worn whatever we wanted. But seriously, and then Karen Phelps comes along and says, over the next few months, the gay and lesbian community is going to face debate. And so you've not only erased us, you've actually taken what is an attack on trans people, and obviously trans and bi-pan as well, and then used it for your own cause. And it was really, marriage was never really a trans issue. I went to a strategic planning day for trans and intersex communities back in 2012. Marriage got mentioned once in the context of forced divorce. So, that was important. We've had a comment come in. Do we want to take this one in as we go, Rebecca? I think it's relevant.
Yes.
I'll play safe. I won't, unless the person wants me to mention a first name, mention it. But the person has said, quote, "For me, it was reading an opinion piece from someone at Marriage Equality Australia saying that bisexuals, polyamorous people were too complicated in inverted commas, and would muddy the waters, and basically we should keep our heads down and let the gay men and lesbians have the spotlight, end quote. Yes, deep breaths, eeks, and all the rest. So I think, there's a welter of evidence from 3 people plus our person commenting that says, yikes. Oh, and also the person said we're just too scary for the straights to want us to have equal rights. Yes, look at us, the 3 of us on screen. We're just all so scary, aren't we?
So, Bridget, how about you?
I think mine was more media, and also just the community around me constantly saying gay marriage, which of course, not all lesbian women identify as gay, so that excludes them too, to a degree. Not quite the same degree, potentially, as us multigender attracted folks, but I definitely think that was when I realised, like, it was a slow realisation for me. It wasn't immediate, and suddenly I went, oh, right, like, then I'm not in the picture, even though it feels very much like I have a lot weighing on this.
Can I just add that I suppose, I'm really scary. Hang on a second. I've got my big rainbow boots on and I'm going to kick people with them. So rainbow Doc Martens, so watch out.
And ScoMo's speech, right? Wasn't it? Like, big rainbow boots going to come and kill your children or something. I don't know.
Yeah. All that. Yeah. So a range of people that, just sort of, it was bad enough, the No campaign and the blatant, well, I better be polite and say malarkey. You fill in your own word, dear Zoom listeners at home. Fill in whatever swear word you want, but in whatever language or dialect. But seriously, it was when your mates on the supposed mates on the Yes campaign sell you out, it hurts. And we've had a comment in about someone co-authoring an article on the transphobia of the Yes campaign, if anyone wants to read. And look, the person's put their email address in, so I'm going to assume on this one it's okay to mention Hannah McCann at unimelb.edu.au if you can't access, and there's a link in there which we'll make sure we put into materials afterwards, the session end after the conference. So yeah, thanks for that, Hannah. And someone's come in and said it was a fabulous piece. Yep. So yeah, very, very true. We'll go on to more of who felt erased as we go through it.
So one thing I think is useful to sort of detail in case people are unaware is the sort of the demographics, or not quite the right word, of the bi plus and multigender attracted community as a whole. Regular research around the world has constantly demonstrated that the bi plus community is the largest part of the LGBTIQA plus community. So we represent the largest share of it. Recent government research / surveying has also supported that. So the estimates overall is that the percentage of LGBTIQA plus population is between 3 and 11%, depending on which study, what their methodology was, how people interacted with that study, etc. So, and since we make up the largest part of that, based on various research in Australia, there's either a population of 2.5 million to 3 million bi plus and multi-gender attracted people. And then of that group, 1 to 2 million who consciously identify as bisexual, pansexual, or another label that denotes multi-gender attraction. So there's between 1.5 and 2 million-ish people who identify as who are multi-gender attracted but use a different label. So our community is quite big when you think about it. And if you start looking at numbers and who is served by the campaign. Oh, Kat, what did you just do to my screen? You're still on screen. I'm still on screen. I'm just like, I can't read anything because it's all one character all the way down my screen. Yes, so we are a large part, And we know that also from research that the outcomes of bi-erasure and biphobia lead to higher rates of poor mental health, higher rates of homelessness and family violence, poorer physical health. We're more likely to experience poverty, and we have high rates of sexual violence against us as well.
I think as well to mention with that, I would say like important to acknowledge within that, of course, like we have started to mention that, of course, gender and your experience of gender, there's a lot of difference in there, and that can make, you know, there's compounding trauma from, you know, being raised in, you know, how am I raised? Let me count the ways, kind of thing, in that debate. And I think, you know, remembering that in those statistics is important too.
So the next topic we sort of thought we'd cover off is what we witnessed as the outcomes of the debate during the postal survey period. Bridget, you mentioned at our sort of dress rehearsal about your work with queer youth in the queer youth service.
Yeah, so I was lucky enough to, at the time, be working in a queer youth service. And it was an incredibly roller coaster of emotions for everyone. Everyone who was working there at the time identified somewhere as LGBTIQA+. And of course, we had our own experiences of that. And then on top of that, had become working with queer youth at the same time. So trying to negotiate all of that. But for the young people, I mean, there was a huge, like everyone just so happy at the outcome. But it definitely plummeted not long after. I think that the mental health, physical health, and like homelessness and all of these things, the risk of homelessness, all of that stuff increased afterwards, and not always at the exact time. You know, it kind of pushed conversations at home with family members that you could maybe live with and not talk about your identity for 6 months, but just knowing it made it impossible to live there for, you know, indefinitely. Yeah.
So I help facilitate at times the Melbourne Bi discussion group, and during the postal survey period, the community was incredibly stressed, traumatized. There was increased levels of suicidality. I know several people who attempted or were close to attempting suicide during that period in our community as a result of the messaging and the erasure from it. So both experiencing biphobia and being erased from the debate as well. It was particularly unpleasant for our community. And also in talking to other people, once everything had been finished, there was a lot of erasure of rainbow families and the structures that rainbow families use, whether they be co-parenting arrangements or families with trans parents or trans children, and all the diversity that we have in our community of the way families are structured was just sort of erased for the heteronormative nuclear family model. Sally, you were talking about feeling targeted by the No campaign and abandoned by the Yes campaign.
Yeah, there could have been a much better approach where it was just made clear that this is a debate about marriage, it's not a debate about trans issues, and there could have been a far more assertive approach taken that was more, I'll say, win-win. And all you had to do was come and ask trans people. I mean, seriously, it's communication 101. And as I mentioned, trans and gender diverse people never felt marriage was a big issue. apart from probably the ending of the so-called forced divorce issue. Just for, if I'll just briefly explain that. So in the past, when it was just M and F could get married, trans person wanted to affirm their gender and change their documents, they had to divorce immediately because we couldn't have two M's or two F's or anything else. And this is also, I wanted to link to a good point Bridge made in terms of language. Same-sex marriage doesn't cut it either, because that erases non-binary people and also elements of the intersex community who have something other than male or female on their birth certificate. And well-known Victorian intersex advocate Tony Briffa fits that. Tony has something else on Tony's birth certificate, and so they were left out as well. And that's why it had to be marriage equality. And it was also, from memory, even after the survey result was announced, there was still struggles to get the language so it was in plain language what it ended up as two people, you know, not related, consensual, and all that sort of thing. And so, yeah, there was those issues. There was also the situation that the No campaigners used the wonderful book, The Gender Fairy by Jo Hurst, for their own purposes. And my sources tell me that Jo was told, don't take any legal action against those No campaigners for misuse until after the campaign, because we'll be told that we're shutting down debate and cancelling, rah, rah, rah. And I just think that's ridiculous. It's Jo's book. And I don't know if there's ever been any rectification of that. It was a very assimilationist approach. I borrowed language from my dear non-binary friend and colleague Navosa Zen, who said it was, you know, this very David Jones catalogue, you know, two people near a picket fence. And as I put it, we're just like you heterosexuals, except we're homosexual. Just don't say that too loudly. And I think the real hurt, and this is where we'll, you know, there's lots more to talk about, but to link to a further part of this, is there's been very little willingness by those key advocates, some of whom we've mentioned, to acknowledge the hurt and harm caused by their campaign. In January 2018 at the Better Together conference, which was a great thing to get us the rainbow communities moving again, there was a panel on post-marriage equality, and there was not one known trans or intersex person, not one person who could claim to speak for the bi community. So they're still speaking for us about what has to happen next. The positive exception, and I really want to put this out there, is Rodney Crone. And, you know, I'm going to be very honest, and I've said this to Rodney's face. Rodney and I have had our differences over many years, but when it came down to it, when, you know, that person, John Howard, you know, we're too politically correct, dumped us all on a desert island in 2004, Rodney let us off that island. And the fact that he was not in Parliament at the end to celebrate with all these bandwagon jumpers and careerists singing I Am, We Are Australia, I think that stinks. And I think the fact that Rodney has the humility and vulnerability and authenticity to acknowledge a mistake and want to do better shows he's a true community leader and a true ally to communities beyond his sense of identity. And I'd really acknowledge him, and I hope that at some point, very honestly, that he does come back to a position of prominence in Australia's rainbow communities that he deserves. And I've said to him, anytime you want to work on trans campaigns, you come and talk to me, and I hope that's the same for bi, because he has a great standing in our communities and has some good networks. And so there hasn't been a learning of their lessons and the acknowledgement of that hurt. And it wasn't the greatest victory for the rainbow communities. It was a victory for parts of us. And, you know, our community doesn't have to, you know, take on stories of lateral violence. And, you know, it's an interesting thing. Sometimes I bring up issues of lateral hostility and poor behaviour going beyond the marriage debate in what I call broader community settings. I was on a session a few weeks ago on diversity in the corporate setting run by the Diversity Council of Australia, and brought up the issue that sadly LGBTIQA, anyone can sexually harass anyone regardless of gender, acknowledging the pain that women on the receiving end feel, and no one had thought about it. And we've got to stop covering up these things. We never said we were perfect. We need to make our communities as strong as they can be. So I think it's time that we moved on, and I think that having a discussion like this, you know, when we will have, as I say, it's not all gloom. We're going to get to some things we can do. I think it's important that we do it and support each other, and where possible link in. I'm rambling a little and I'll wind up, to our allies across, well, you know, for me as someone who's trans and bi, intersex, and also acknowledging my privilege as a white non-Aboriginal person. Whilst I am Jewish, I feel like I'm Anglo-passing, if I can put it that way, acknowledging the hurt of multicultural disability communities and many, many others who all felt sold out. But I feel we can stick together properly.
Thanks, Sally. One of the major contributors to the No campaign were religious groups, and I don't think that can be denied. For example, the huge donation by the Sydney Anglicans to the No campaign. But there were some spots of rainbow delight within the religious communities that I think we should acknowledge as well. Particularly, I grew up Catholic. I'm no longer a member of any religion, but I grew up Catholic, and the fact that so many Catholics completely ignored the instructions from the priests and bishops and everything to vote no, the Catholic support for human rights, I think that actually made me quite happy. I was also really pleased to read the Australian Council of Hindu Clergy's letter in relation to support for marriage equality, and the amount of time they'd clearly thought about it and thought about how marriage is conceived within Hinduism and then brought across. And it was a very, very lovely letter to read. It was particularly during the sort of darker moments. I could just go back to this letter and go, look, this is so nice. Sally, do you want to talk about the Jewish community?
Yeah, and look at a sort of as a last minute extra preparation, I did find a Wikipedia article this morning, endorsements in the Australian Marriage Law Postal Survey, and so religious groups who've advocated a yes vote included Australian Council of Hindu Clergy, Buddhism Australia, Pitt Street Uniting Church, which has been wonderful for a long time, a wonderful pioneering lesbian, Dorothy McRae McMahon started her work there. Quakers Australia, I've got to say it, they knew their oats. There's puns even in a serious session like this. St Michael's Uniting Church in Melbourne. But yes, for me, as someone of Jewish background, the Rabbinic Council of the Union of Progressive Judaism have been very supportive. And going beyond that, you know, as we've seen some of the debates since, it was wonderful when there was inquiries into the so-called religious exemptions that Mount Scopus Jewish College here in Melbourne simply put a one-paragraph letter into one of those inquiries. We have never used the religious exemptions at our school and don't see any need to do so. The end, full stop. So I think that these things are really important, and also the Wikipedia article acknowledges Frank Brennan, I beg your pardon, Catholic priest, and Kay Goldsworthy, the Archbishop, Anglican Archbishop of Perth. But also there's a 500 Australian faith leaders signed a joint letter asking the Australian government to enact same-sex marriage, including all of the faiths and Muslim as well. And we also, it's a good chance to mention for those who may be bi plus and of Islamic background, the group Mahaba here in Melbourne, who do great work led by Noor, spelled N-U-R, a retired out gay imam. And I think that's wonderful to see. So I think the last part of the religious part is that with all this stuff, yet no one on the Yes campaign tried to, we'll say, unwedge religion from, you know, the debate, and also that, you know, allowing same marriage equality was going to give more religious freedom, because now churches would be able, and synagogues and other places would be able to marry couples other than male or female, and the marriage would be valid as, you know, not just on that, you know, particular building or land site or whatever, but when the person walked out into the public. So I think that we could have done a lot more in terms of countering the religious nonsense. But again, just come and ask us.
So Bridget, how about you and your either friends, family, community, religious experience of this?
Yeah, sure. I grew up Catholic as well, Irish Catholic. And my mum and I wouldn't call her practicing as much anymore, but she definitely, my family, immediate family definitely were happy to vote yes, but I think a lot of that was deeply rooted in the presentation of the Yes campaign and the conversations. I was not out to my family at the time, or as the new language we're trying to use, I hadn't let my family into that part of my life at that time. So the conversations that were happening about it were really exclusionary, and, you know, family talking religiously or friends talking about religion. In the context of the debate, it was like, again, it was very a lot of bi-erasure going on. But I think their willingness to vote yes was based on the very palatable presentation of the Yes campaign. And if we had been included, I don't know that my family would have voted yes, or part of my family would have voted yes. So I know that's not a nice thing to say, but it's true. But at the same time, we definitely should not have been thrown under the bus just so a smaller majority of the LGBTI community could have just got married sooner.
Yeah, can I bounce off that, bring in some of the comments just to catch up on those, because I think they're very relevant to what Bridget has said. Again, I'm not going to acknowledge names for the sake of the recording, but you know, one person has said, unless someone expressly puts their permission in, someone who is in in inverted commas, same-sex relationship, I couldn't bring bisexuality up to the people around me at the time because the Yes campaign was so narrow. It compounded my internalised biphobia at the time. Yeah, that sense of being abandoned and sold out, totally affirm that. And also we've had the point come up that there's been a lag between the causes and effects of trauma and how alienating it was. And I was going to add that Rebecca knows a dear colleague of ours, formerly on Bi Alliance Committee, who just went off social media, couldn't take it, and hasn't really re-engaged since. And also there's been, sadly, rainbow relationships that broke up because all the emotions came up, which we're going to talk about in a little bit as well as we get to the, you know, that, when was it, November, the whatever it was, the Wednesday, when I couldn't sleep and went down to my office at 5:30 in the morning because it was near the State Library in Melbourne. But that there was just so much emotion that, you know, brought back up people who thought they had their lives pretty settled. In fairness, in all of the rainbow communities, and it all came up again. We've had a comment come in there that Rebecca and I lost a 2-decade friendship over it. Yeah, this is the sort of hurt that was caused, and, you know, just sadly, well, hasn't healed yet for many of us, particularly bi+, and again, for myself, trans and gender diverse.
I don't want to out them. So someone I'm very close to called up their aunt and uncle after having talked to their parents and were very, very comfortable with their parents going to be voting yes. They called up their aunt and uncle, who are very religiously Anglican conservative, and said, please vote yes or do not vote at all. Don't vote no. Just do not vote if you're not in support, or vote yes. And then it's like, oh, but you know, the biblical definition of marriage. I'm like, do you know how many things have changed in the Bible if we're going to rely on that as the source of all truth for something? How many things have changed in interpretation over the centuries since it was all collated and put together? like so many things that have not been permissible are now permissible, and so on and so forth. Why would you just stick to that one thing unless you're a raging queerphobe? So they don't trust their aunt and uncle anymore, which I don't blame them, because why would you after a conversation like that? And they were not out to their aunt and uncle. They screwed up their courage and told their aunt and uncle about this in order to try and, here is a human face to this. It's not an abstract concept. And they were still, no, we don't support. And that would have been one of multiple conversations happening across Australia. And the family relationships that were fractured and broken as a result of this unnecessary postal survey, which was not binding and was solely there to abrogate Parliament's responsibilities for making laws.
I just want to say to that I got one of the calls from what was Victorian Trades Hall Council here. You're going to talk to your family, and look, whilst my relationship at that point with my family had come a long way, I didn't want to talk to my parents about it. My mum's passed on a year later. I've never asked, and my sister and I have a very fragile relationship, and I just didn't want to risk that. And I don't think that they understood the issues for trans people and how we can struggle with our family of origin at times to get any sense of connection. And so I think that's another issue as well. I want to acknowledge a comment, someone who tore down no posters on their uni campaign. Thank you for doing that. That's gutsy stuff. And, took a lot of strength. Took a lot of strength to get through, but let's hold that point as well.
All right, so we're going to move on to the unexpected and expected positives as a result of the whole thing. That in addition to some of the positives that we've already discussed, some of the other things that helped either in very odd ways or in actual really good ways. So one of my favourites, and every time I saw it I would burst out laughing, was that the No campaign chose the bi-pride colours, because I don't know. And then I just wondered if all of them were bi and they were upset at being erased too. And it was just a whole little mental thing I could imagine in my head, which would just sort of take away the horrible burden of what was actually going on.
Mine was the gay agenda memes. God, I love a good gay. I to this day love a good gay agenda meme. Even though I'm not very visible in that moment, I still love, I don't know, a politician video of them saying the gay agenda, and then it's like, I don't know, us people dancing in a club or something. I'm not that funny, but they're great.
To digress on that, someone did put out the gay agenda years ago, and it was very humorous. It was sort of wake up at 10 o'clock, do brunch, blah, 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 blah. 2 till 2:30, work out how to infiltrate schools, churches, government, etc., etc., and then 2:30 go off to the gym, and then go out for dinner, go clubbing, come home, or something like that. And so the fact that, I think that just shows how stupid those phrases are. I think is some degree of revenge. But I'd agree with you there, Rebecca, that just cracked me up that the No campaign, No campaign didn't do any factual research. Gee, what a surprise there.
But also I think like it weirdly is like, is that a unexpected positive of being invisible in that in the debate? Like they accidentally then used our flag.
It was just,
I didn't know what it was because we're not involved.
It was quite bizarre and ironic, yeah.
I think straight people think if you could end up with a man, you would. That's
and it makes you ask those questions. It's like if you're saying that all of this is a choice, for example, which is an argument it's like, well, clearly, if you feel that it's that easy, then just do it. Like just relax. It's okay. You can love who you love. You do not have to stick within this rigid heteronormative paradigm. Just love people. It's fine.
I think as well it's for me it felt very like defining that your relationship that you end up with, which I know I just used that phrase, but who you're with when you die is the sexuality that you were the whole time, and you took that long, like it's that perfect love match kind of other halfness that can be really toxic.
So one of the other positives, we actually go to the breakdown of the votes before we talk about the actual day when the results were announced. I live in the electorate of Wills, which is the northern suburbs of Melbourne, Coburg, Fawkner, Brunswick. Was Bob Hawke's seat back in the day, so, you know, been held by Labor a lot. It's also, my suburb is very, very diverse. We have a Catholic church, a Buddhist temple, a Greek Orthodox church, a mosque, Anglican church, and we used to have a Samoan Presbyterian church, but they've moved. So we've got a huge religious constituency here. And 70+% of the people here voted yes, regardless of their religious background. There were less religious people than 70% in the electorate when you look at the Bureau Statistics data from the census. So basically, the huge, overwhelming support in my area for marriage equality was just such a lovely thing, because it meant that I knew that this area I live in, this electorate I live in, is going to be supportive of other things to do with our communities. It's not, it's something that people have thought about and gone, no, why wouldn't human rights be important? And that made me really happy. I know, Sally, you had a great experience as well.
Well, yeah, my electorate, which covers suburbs Bulleen, where I live, hence that translation of Bolin from earlier, but also covers, well, it's called Templestowe, but as my sat-nav system likes to call it, Templestowe, which is the seat of Menzies. And that's held by, I almost feel like saying deep breath, stay calm everyone, Kevin Andrews, Mr. Alleged part in branch stacking, as well as being so religious. And the fact that, you know, Menzies got 57% yes, and the national average was that 61.6. I'm going to have to say this, I just feel like that was so cool. And to give some demographics of the electorate, it has that traditional population of, we'll say, mid-20th century migrants of, say, Greek, Italian type of background, but it also has an increasing Iranian population. Now, you might think that all those sorts of peoples would be very conservative, but no, their basic sense of fairness and justice came through. And I've got to say, I've lived here for 10.5 years, and fingers crossed, I've never had any issue with queerphobia. So it's that nice sort of conservative view. I'm just going to digress quickly. You go down to the local shops and it's, hey, Sally, how you going? All that sort of thing. People know who you are. And I've got to say, in one shop in my area one day, they know me well, and I went in, and it's run by father and son, and the son now has children, and the father said, my grandkids come out as trans. I don't understand trans, but I know I love him. So for all the conservative stuff in this area, it's just they're nice people. And I've got to say, at a later date, I met the trans grandchild, and it was open, you know, such a sense of community. I go tongue-tied when I meet young trans people, by the way, because it's like, oh, and we just said hi, and we knew what we were feeling. So there is a great sense of community in this area, and I really like where I live. And we're queering it up. I've got to say, yesterday on one of my walks, I bumped into Felicity Marlowe, who of Rainbow Families, who lives in the area. So we'll gradually put on the bi agenda or the queer agenda or something.
How about you, Bridget, and your area?
Yeah, sure. I live in a very one of the most affluent, if not the most affluent suburb in Brisbane. I'm not wealthy. I have somehow procured an apartment here, but there's a lot of wealth, and a very liberal for quite a long time now. The member for the area actually is at least Queensland's first or the only openly gay MP for the Liberal Party, which is Trevor Evans, who has a lot to apologise for to the community as well. Should have asked people to take a deep breath for Trevor too, sorry, I forgot. And a huge majority, I believe, voted yes, but there is a lot of, it's known that one of the suburbs is where like the wealthy white gay men live, who we have found out, I'm such a bummer, but have ran it recently, really kind of out of the trying to change things now that they've got what they needed. But in saying that, I'm pretty visibly queer where I live, and there's not a huge amount of diversity, but I have never encountered a problem myself either. But also I'm cis and white, so there's those privileges that I'm aware of. So yeah.
So if we talk about the day itself, when the results were announced, and we let whatever the dude was from Bureau of Statistics have his 15 minutes of fame, and we agonized through his slow speech about how everything was calculated, and when we didn't want to know any of that.
Rebecca, we didn't talk about the unexpected upside that guy got his moment.
He did, and I still don't remember his name, so not that good enough moment for him. Sorry.
He's famous at the time.
He's etched in the stats history books, yeah.
So I was standing in a room with a whole lot of, the Pride Network at the workplace I was working at the time. And rainbow food had been put on the table, so there's fairy bread and little cakes and stuff. But no one could touch that food. Everyone looked at it and would turn away while waiting for the broadcast to start, and then the broadcast started, and the slow speech started, and everyone was almost trembling with, come on, hurry up, we want to know. And then the numbers were read out, and everyone did the maths before he announced the actual yes vote, because it was just easier to do the maths that way. And there was a huge relief. People burst into tears. It was not pure joy. It was the Pride Network I was standing in amongst. It was just relief that it was over, and that an outcome that was not terrible had happened.
Yeah.
Sally, you were at the State Library, weren't you?
Yeah, so going back to that day in November, I just couldn't sleep. I drove into work thinking I might get one of the cheap parking spots on the street early, but still didn't get there. Did a little bit of work just to keep my mind off at our office, where we're at our office at 100 Drummond Street in Carlton, as we like to call it, really proud centre, is walking distance down to the State Library. So I hung out there, had the obligatory caffeine, and then walked down to the State Library and got there about 20 to 10, and a number of people from Drummond Street and Queer Space were there, including the councillors, and I felt like I had to stand with them. I just didn't know what was going to happen, what was my emotions, and I just felt very safe with them. Obviously, it was a very queer-friendly crowd, but you could feel the anxiety in the air, and then at that, said the numbers accounting person 7 or 8 minutes past 10, when finally Anthony McManus, a fantastic campaigner, 61.6%, and I was doing fist pumps of relief. I should have done, here's my obligatory World Wrestling Entertainment reference, Daniel Bryan, yes chance, sort of thing. But it was just this huge release of tension. Finally, it was done. Mm-hmm. And I was standing near Ro Allen, Commissioner, now LGBTIQ Commissioner to use the current title, and there was just hugs and people like Rose Partner Kay and Karen Field from Drummond Street, and it was finally, there it was. And to get such a convincing result, I remember thinking, if we got 50 to 55% yes, it would have been 55 to 60 okay, but anything above 60 I think was going to be reasonable. The highest poll I remember of yes at any time up to the vote was 67%, and given the squillions of money that the No campaign threw into it so that it only wiped off around 3 to 5% in the end was quite remarkable. And there is a bit of satisfaction in the fact that Lyle Shelton, who had that budget, had to go off and join Corgi Bernardi's party, and that's disappeared too since. So Lyle will probably end up on Sky News, who cares? So and that's sort of satisfying, a sort of moo-ha-ha way as well. But the other part of it that night was the celebration in Lygon Street near Trades Hall, and I caught up with a dear friend of mine who, had those bittersweet feelings. She, content warning mention of mental health and suicide issues, had lost a partner too early, and it brought up all those issues, and we just sat there hugging and being together. So it was a huge release, and it was great. I do have to say, after the State Library, after all the adrenaline drained out, I went back and had a Trana nap or a Panna nap on the floor of my office for an hour because I was just exhausted. But it was an amazing, it was great to get it done, and that we, moved, gone through the roadblock. But, we did it was a huge roadblock to get through all the same.
I'm just conscious of time because I have another webinar to run immediately after this one. So Bridget, what was your experience of the day that the results were announced?
Yeah, I was alone. I chose to be alone because I was pretty terrified. But I was alone for the finding out myself, and then cried, and then went into the youth service we were talking about earlier, and it was like they were jumping for joy. I was like, thank God I don't have to console this room full of young people. This did not go badly, or like Sally said, or just like got 51%, or at least it was a little bit better than that. So yeah, and then went out that night and had a bit of a celebration.
It was such a stressful period. And as I think you said, Bridget, when we were talking about this initially, that the win came at such a huge cost to not just our community, but all rainbow communities, to go through that period of harm.
Yeah, and I think in talking about people who need to apologise for that, I mean, I'm not holding my breath for it, but there are lots of people that have huge responsibilities, and they do not know the amount of harm that came to even one of those people that were affected. And I think one day people will look back and really not understand how that even happened. And will be disgusted as well. So.
Very quickly, I wanted to talk to that, Bridget, about, it was May 2018, where there was an interview with Penny Wong in one of the weekend glossy magazines for the newspaper chains, and I remember saying, we've all moved on. And I feel very frustrated by that. And only last year, in a room of around 10 people with witnesses, I will just say, a prominent rich white cisgender gay man said, well, we all had to make sacrifices to get marriage seriously. And I just think that is my frustration, that we haven't acknowledged and learned those lessons. And all the same, I'm gonna want to say one more thing about that in a second. But the other thing I want to say for now, there's a great video put out by Drummond Street Services and Queer Space with about 20 people saying it's more complex than yes, that was released about into the middle of 2018. Some great advocates, Jackie Brown talking disability, my dear friend and colleague Grace Lee, many others, Mark Camilleri, many others from around the community, and I'd urge people to have a look at that, pop that out in links to YouTube afterwards. But I think that there was, all the costs were too huge, and as we can only slowly, but I think there are things we can do. So I'm going to talk to that last thing right on the end. But do we want to check in? Are there any queries? I know you have to head off in a few seconds, Rebecca.
But I have to head off and close this and open a new one. So unfortunately, I can't leave this running and go, because I'm hosting the other one. I'm sorry, everybody. But yeah, the tyrannies of software means that I have to end this one to start a new one. Thank you so much, Bridget and Sally, for being part of this panel.
I want to say one more thing. For all that pain, and I totally affirm it for everyone in the comments that have come up, I have felt the most powerful in my bi+ identity over the last few days as I ever have. And I think that there's one thing we can proactively do to prevent that sort of selling out again. I'm going to put up the idea that it is time for a national bi+ organisation in Australia. The intersex community can do it, and they have done the Darlington Statement and other things. And please put your yeses into the chat if you're interested, and contact me by all media.
The new voting campaign.
You have my sword. And I'm going to stick my, I can't put my money where my mouth is. I'm not a rich white gay man, but I'm going to put my time and my heart and my mind where my mouth is. I'd be prepared to be involved in a leadership group to achieve that. So let's put that into our results for now. Let's park it for now. But if you want to if you've got ideas, or even just want to get in touch with me to say you're interested now, let's do it. And all I can say is I feel our bi community is the strongest it's ever been. But as a 55-year-old, that means a lot to me. All I can say is bye 5.
Yes, we love you, and we love everyone who's come. And I want to acknowledge the pain, and if you need help, please go to standbyus.com. If this was triggering and this has upset you, please go there, and there are some resources linked, or reach out to one of the organisations that have helped put this on. I'm from Brisbane Bi+ Network. You can reach out to us too.
All right, thank you. Must have to dash for the next one. Thank you everyone who's attended this one. If you're attending the next one, I'll see you over there.
Right. Celebrate Bi Week. Bye.
Bye.